One thing that Andrew mentioned, he talked about stand your ground states. Don, can you cover that a little bit to give us an understanding of what that really means, and duty to retreat as well?
Well, I can touch on that. Andrew already did when he was talking about the element of avoidance. A number of states, I think you said there are 11 that have duty to retreat, so that means 39, if I've done my math, that has a form of stand your ground, which means there is no legal duty to retreat before using deadly force if you are in fact facing an imminent threat of great bodily harm or death. So that's one thing that you don't have to worry about tactically or legally, although we'll talk, I hope, more about whether it makes sense to actually stand your ground if you have any other options. But legally, you have the right to confront that force that you're being threatened with your own proportional level of force.
Yeah. So from a legal perspective, what it does is take that element of avoidance off the table as a target of attack for the prosecutor. So instead of there being 5 elements a prosecutor can attack, now there's only 4 because avoidance has been removed. That's obviously good for the defender. As you suggest, from a real world practical perspective, if it's possible for you not to get into a gunfight simply by retreating from the fight, if you can do that consistent with safety, obviously we ought not be getting in the gunfights we don't need to be getting into.
Absolutely. And that leads us into, some of the, or a lot of the problems that we have with the members is, knowing when to display their weapon in self-defense. So can we kind of, cover that as well?
So the moment you make someone else aware that you have a gun and you're making them aware of that to change their behavior, which is what we're doing. When we say, stay back, I have a gun, right? Their behavior is something that's frightening you. You're making them aware you have a gun to change that behavior. Arguably, you've checked all the boxes for a charge of aggravated assault with a deadly weapon, because the crime of assault has to do with putting someone else in reasonable fear of imminent harm. Aggravated assault, putting someone in reasonable fear of deadly force harm. With a deadly weapon, you're telling them you have a gun. Now, whether or not a prosecutor would bring that charge is often largely a function of policies within the prosecutor's department. It's largely at their discretion, but you are putting yourself at risk for that charge. They may not bring it, but you're potentially at risk. So I generally urge people not to be engaging in that conduct unless they have a very good reason for doing it. Personally, it's hard for me to imagine circumstances in which I would make someone aware that I have a gun unless the circumstances were such that I would be prepared to use that gun in self-defense. Actually, now, of course, once you present the gun, circumstances often change and you don't need to use it. So this is not a reflexive draw the gun and shoot. Often the bad guy sees the gun, decides they brought, a fist to a gunfight and they're not interested and they run away, and that's perfect. You just won that fight without having to fire a shot. But when you did all that, you did incur the risk of facing a felony charge of aggravated assault with a deadly weapon. In most jurisdictions, that's good for 10 to 20 years in prison once the gun sentencing enhancement is added on. So I would urge people, don't incur that legal risk without darn good reason, and think through ahead of time, before you're facing that threat, under what circumstances you'd be prepared to incur that legal risk. A lot of what we need to do in terms of making sound decisions, legally sound and tactically sound decisions in self-defense, is to thought experiment these scenarios ahead of time. We can't foresee every factual variation of some kind of criminal aggression, but most of them tend to fall into common buckets. They tend to be armed robberies. They tend to be rape attempts. They tend to be carjacking. So in a generalized sense, you can have buckets of scenarios where you might think, all right, in this bucket, I'm just walking away. In this bucket of threat, maybe I'll use pepper spray. In this bucket of threat, maybe I'll go hands-on. In this very limited bucket of threat, maybe I'll prepare to go to a gun. And in this tiny bucket, maybe I'm prepared to actually shoot someone.
Absolutely.
In self-defense. But to the extent you can put those scenarios, those infinite area scenarios in those buckets, it really facilitates sound decision-making in the crisis of the moment. When you're facing that threat and you have to make life-changing decisions for that other person and for yourself, it really facilitates your ability, because all right, I'm in this bucket. This is not a gun bucket. This is a pepper spray bucket. This is a jujitsu bucket.
Yes.
But then as circumstances change, the person displays a weapon. Now we're in the gun bucket.
Yes.
Right now we're in the deadly force bucket. So instead of having to think through 1,000 different scenarios, you just have 4 or 5 buckets of scenarios where you have kind of prepared self-defense responses that you know are legally sound because you learned the legal principles and you studied all this stuff. And so you know you're on solid ground. And frankly, I think that also helps people. I do the legal stuff, right? But the priority has to be winning the physical fight. If you don't win the physical fight, the rest of the stuff doesn't matter.
That's correct.
But you don't want to win the physical fight in such a way that you spend the rest of your life in jail. And I think by learning the legal stuff, it facilitates your ability to be decisive in the tactical phase, to strip away ambiguity from these scenarios, make decisive decisions, be more effective in the physical fight because you know you're on solid legal ground, as solid as you can possibly be, because you've thought through these issues beforehand.